okay, so you're here probably because uh, you're trying to figure out, what's going on with all this talk about immigration and the economy,
Right.
and especially with, this idea of mass deportations being thrown around,
Yeah.
and what that could potentially mean for, for all of us economically.
Yeah.
And it can get pretty complicated really fast. So we're going to take a deep dive today, and try to break it down into, something that makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we're looking at some really interesting analysis from economist Paul Krugman. He's got this online newsletter. It's called the Substack.
You're right.
And he had a piece recently that was highlighted in a video from the YouTube channel, The Ring of Fire.
Yeah.
And we always like to kind of dig into these these different perspectives and see what they have to say. And so that's what we're going to do today.
And one thing that struck me right away is that, it's not just all hypothetical.
Right.
We're already seeing some real world reactions happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And the YouTube video actually talks about this.
Okay.
They're reporting that, there are already undocumented workers in places like Florida and California who are choosing not to go to work.
Wow.
Right now. And this is, even before any mass deportations have even started.
That's significant.
It is. And it makes sense,
Yeah.
because the transcript mentions that enforcement has really ramped up, just in the last week.
Right.
And so you can imagine that that's creating a lot of fear and uncertainty.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, fear is a powerful motivator, right?
Yeah,
It can really change people's behavior.
for sure. And the transcript goes on to say that this is actually having a really direct impact on agriculture.
Oh, wow.
There are reports of fruits and vegetables going unharvested.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And
Oh,
and this is happening really quickly. I mean, we're talking like within 5 days.
Really?
Yeah. So, I mean, it just makes you think, even these small scale disruptions are having a real impact.
Yeah. It's amazing how interconnected things are.
Absolutely.
You don't always think about it, but like the food on our tables, that relies on a whole chain of events.
Right.
And people. And if one part of that chain breaks down,
The whole thing can be affected. Yeah.
Exactly.
And, we were talking about, the potential for mass deportations and what that could mean long term.
Right.
And Krugman's analysis really gets into that.
Okay.
And his argument is that, mass deportations wouldn't just be, a temporary removal of people. It would be, many of those deported would face a permanent bar to reentry.
Oh, wow. Okay. So this isn't just like a temporary dip in the workforce then. It's like potentially a long-term reduction in a specific segment of workers.
Oh, exactly. And
Yeah.
and that's, something to really consider because
Yeah.
even if, our listeners, maybe they don't work in agriculture or construction directly,
Right.
those sectors are so interconnected with the rest of the economy.
Sure. Yeah. So what happens there is going to have ripple effects. Absolutely. And Krugman, he really emphasizes that, immigrant labor, both documented and undocumented,
Right.
is a huge part of the workforce in a lot of key industries.
Right.
It's not just one or two things. It's a lot of different things.
Yeah. And the transcript actually gives some pretty stark examples.
Sure.
They talk about, the construction of houses, the harvesting of food. Of course, we've already touched on that.
Right.
Working on ranches, building roads, building buildings, including schools.
Wow. So, I mean, we're talking about things that affect like everybody.
Exactly. And Krugman's conclusion is that, based on his analysis, no industry will be completely untouched by these potential labor shortages.
And that makes you think about like just your everyday life, right?
Exactly.
Like the things that you buy, the services you use.
Right.
How many of those are connected to these sectors,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can think about it. If the cost of harvesting produce goes up because there aren't enough workers,
Yeah.
well, guess what that means?
Prices go up.
Prices are going to go up at your local grocery store.
Yeah. I hadn't even thought about it that way.
It's true. And it's interesting because, you have these potential economic disruptions that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
And then you have, what's being said by some folks.
Okay.
And the YouTube transcript mentions that, Trump recently has been saying that the economy is doing great and that inflation is not a priority. And it's interesting because, not too long ago, the message was very different.
Totally. Yeah. It was all about, the economy struggling, and now it's like a complete 180.
Yeah, it feels like a real shift in rhetoric.
It does.
And according to Krugman's analysis, it seems like, Trump is probably aware of these potential negative economic repercussions
Right.
of mass deportations. But the analysis suggests that he simply doesn't care.
Wow. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is. Yeah, it's a pretty stark assessment of the situation.
Yeah, and it kind of implies that, maybe there are other priorities that are being put ahead of, potential economic instability.
Right. And it's not just about, the numbers, the economic data.
Yeah.
The YouTube video also talks about how, some voters are starting to kind of realize the implications of these promises that were made about deportation.
Yeah.
And it's sort of being presented as like a lesson learned.
It makes sense, though, right? Because in the abstract, it's one thing.
Right.
But when you start to see how it could actually play out,
Exactly.
that's when it hits home.
And it's important to remember, these warnings about the potential economic impacts, they weren't just coming out of nowhere.
Right.
Economists like Krugman and even some, more conservative voices were raising these concerns before.
So it's not like this was a surprise.
Right.
It's not like this was unforeseen.
Exactly.
So, it's interesting to see it kind of play out.
Yeah. So to kind of sum up what we've been talking about, we're looking at a situation where, these potential big shifts in immigration policy, especially this idea of mass deportations,
Right.
could lead to some pretty major economic disruptions.
Yeah.
Starting with, labor shortages in these key sectors,
Right.
and potentially leading to longer term workforce challenges. And all of that, is kind of set against this backdrop of, this optimistic economic outlook that's being presented.
Right. Yeah. It's like two very different narratives happening at the same time.
And I think, the big takeaway for our listeners is to really understand how interconnected everything is.
Yeah.
We tend to think in silos,
Yeah.
like, oh, this is the agricultural sector, this is the construction sector.
Right.
But it's not that simple.
It's all connected.
Yeah,
Yeah. Labor shortages in one area can have these cascading effects.
exactly.
It can affect prices, it can affect the availability of goods and services, and ultimately it can affect broader economic growth.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
for example, think about if there aren't enough workers to build houses.
Right.
Well, that affects not just the construction industry, but it affects the lumber suppliers.
Right.
It affects the real estate agents.
Right.
It affects the local governments who rely on permit fees and taxes.
Absolutely. And that brings us to kind of our final thought for our listeners to consider.
Okay.
We've talked about the potential economic shifts that could happen as a result of changes in immigration policy.
Right.
But what about the societal changes? Think beyond just the raw economic data.
Okay.
How might communities adapt? How might industries evolve? How might our daily lives look different, in the years to come if these predictions hold true?
That's a really good question.
It's something to ponder. It is, yeah.
It's not just about the numbers. It's about people's lives
Absolutely.
and how those lives could be impacted
Yeah.
by these potential shifts.
That's a great point.
So, yeah, it's a lot to think about.
It's,
But hopefully, we've given our listeners some food for thought.
hey.
Yeah, and something, to kind of keep in mind as this issue continues to unfold.
Absolutely. It's an important conversation to be having.
It is for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure.
Likewise.
Okay, we'll see you next time.
See you later.